Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome, and thank you guys so much for joining us for another great video meetup. Today's sponsored by Cloudflare. As always, I'm your host, Justin Ong. We've got a great show for you guys today. We're going to be talking all about what you guys need to know to better protect yourselves against some of the nasties out there, including DDoS attack, malicious bots, and data theft attempts. And so for more on this, we've got a great panel of experts for you guys today, including Spicehead from the IT Pro community, one that I think you guys might know, as well as an expert from Cloudflare. So without further ado, let's go ahead and kick it off with a round of introductions. Batting first, I think you guys might have heard of him once or twice. He's been known to pop into the community from time to time to give his thoughts, usually very measured, but we're always excited to have him on. Mr. Scott Allen Miller. Scott, welcome to the show. How's it going today? Scott, you might be on mute. Am I on mute? No, sorry, you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you now. Sorry about that.
There we go. Thanks, I'm doing well. Glad to be here.
Scott, what have you been up to? Can you tell us a little bit about what you've been up to? If for folks who haven't met you before, tell us a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, so for the last nearly 20 years, I've been a technical fellow with Niagara Technology Group. I am currently, just in the last few days, I've kind of moved out to Arizona. I've been in Texas for a long time. I'm now the COO of a global logistics and supply chain software as a service vendor. So we work, so I have CIO and CTO functions both flow up to me, as well as operations. So I get to kind of play in all those spaces, and now I get to be that guy that everybody talks about, their boss that doesn't understand tech, but he used to do it, right? So now he thinks he knows everything and gets in the way. So I'm that guy.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, like I mentioned, I have a ton of CIO buzzwords that I can pass on to you. You say digital transformation over and over again, maybe single pane of glass once or twice. That'll really boost your credibility.
We'll bring all those buzzwords together for synergy.
That'll be perfect. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. We are excited to have you on and look forward to hearing your thoughts. Our next panelist is a security expert from Cloudflare. Everyone, please give a welcome to Tim Fong. Tim, welcome to the show. How's it going today?
Awesome, Justin. Hey, thanks for having us on here, and great meeting you, Scott. Thanks for joining.
Tim, do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and what you do for Cloudflare?
Yeah, sure. So I've been in product and product marketing for Cloudflare, focusing on security products.
Very cool. And Tim, where are you guys based out of?
We're based out of San Francisco. We've got offices worldwide, though, in Singapore, United Kingdom, Boston, Austin, Texas, Singapore.
All right, very cool. We're excited to have you on, Tim, as well, and we can't wait to hear from you. Before we go any further, y'all, there are a few things I did want to point out. As always, Cloudflare has provided us with some great resources below, so make sure to check that out. And most importantly, if you have questions for Tim or Scott, we are going to be taking your questions live. So make sure to get those questions into the Q&A widget, as you see. And last but not least, as a big thank you for hanging out with us this afternoon, one of y'all is going to be going home with a GoPro Hero 5 Deluxe bundle. So good luck to all y'all. Make sure to get those questions into chat and into the Q&A widget, and we'll be announcing the winner of that GoPro at the end of the show. Well, Tim, let's go ahead and start off with you. It seems like security obviously is in the news a lot, and I think it's now starting to kind of hit the mainstream, so to speak, when it comes to the business world. It's no longer something that IT is concerned about, but there seems to be a lot more awareness at the business level. Would you say that that's true, first of all? And would you say that being knowledgeable and being aware often equates to safety?
Yeah, great question. So I definitely would agree that there's more awareness, not only in the news, but in high-profile cases, or even the President of the United States under Obama having gotten involved. But awareness doesn't necessarily equate to knowledge. And it also doesn't necessarily relate to being more secure. So they may be more aware. They may not really know what's at stake. And as a result of that, they may not have actually done anything to improve their security posture. So it's sort of on a spectrum. So when we talk to customers or companies, there's awareness, but there's still a cycle of learning more about it and then actually doing something to address those issues.
So based on the companies that you're working with, Tim, are you guys seeing a lot of changes as far as the companies themselves that may be impacting their susceptibility to these types of attacks like DDoS, malicious bots, and data theft attempts?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of three pillars that seems to be making them exposed. So there's changes that have nothing to do with security, but just for them to become a modern company in an internet world. So there are changes that they make, which open themselves up to vulnerability. And then you marry that with what's going on outside, which is attackers getting stronger, and then governments becoming more sort of aware and applying more scrutiny. That becomes sort of this recipe for an overall increased risk.
Okay. Scott, what are your thoughts? How do you feel like, overall awareness of these types of security issues is increasing? And do you feel like companies are any safer because of it?
Well, I definitely think that, without a doubt, the awareness factor is certainly there. Everyone's talking about security. Everyone's, to some degree, thinking about it. Whether they're thinking about it well or not is a different question, but they're definitely concerned with it and starting to look at it, right? So awareness, I think, is pretty much a foregone conclusion. Knowledge and action are, of course, a lot more difficult, and I think what we're seeing is that the level of ability to react to security concerns is not keeping pace with the ability to enact security concerns, right? The bad guys have bigger funding and more effort is being put in, and they are advancing probably more quickly than most companies are managing to mitigate that, right? And partially that's one of the things we see today is that with a lot of applications out there are starting to use a lot more discrete APIs via microservices, right? So that's like a big thing, and a lot of companies want to do that with their applications. And there's a lot of great reasons for that, right? But one of the natural artifacts of that is that exposure to DDoS, for example, becomes much higher, and there needs to be types of mitigation that we didn't have before. So even though you may be aware of security, you may not be aware of exactly how it affects what you've been doing and whether you're going to be able to then keep pace with all these people who know exactly how to, use what you're doing against you is a big challenge. So I think that awareness is doing great. Whether or not we're actually leveraging that awareness into something really useful yet, that's the bigger challenge.
Yeah, and Tim, Scott was mentioning, the attackers are becoming a lot more sophisticated as well. What are you guys seeing based on your research and experiences? Are attackers becoming more powerful, and if so, how?
Yeah, I think there seem to be three threads, if I had to think about it. The first one is they're far more distributed. So, and that's gotten even worse with IoT devices. So they're able to attack from many, many, many different sources and geographic locations, which just makes them the volumes higher as well as harder to stop. The second one, which I think is interesting, we've been picking up, is the rise of ransomware. And so the correlation is that they're now incentivized. There's now money to be made. They're not just kids goofing around. There's money to be made by making a DDoS attack or a data theft sort of part of an overall goal to hold companies ransom. And then the third one is more technical, but I think it's actually really important, is some of these attacks, particularly DDoS attacks, are moving from the network to the application. And those are more devastating and harder to detect and block.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Scott, you mentioned, I thought it's interesting you brought up microservices and APIs, because it does seem like consumers are more and more demanding this level of openness, this level of interoperability, and this level of flexibility. Is like exposure to these types of security risks just always going to be a natural byproduct of that? Or is it really a matter of us figuring out a way to do this safely?
Well, I'm sure it's a combination of both. As we become a more technical society, people do want just more access to everything. And the more things we want access to, obviously, the more things there are to attack. And being interconnected automatically makes us more exposed, because one thing can attack another. We depend on more separate pieces. Each piece being smaller means there's simply larger attack surfaces as a society. not just as an individual company, right? So it may be that end users are actually more exposed than individual services are because they're dependent upon so many services. But each of those services depends on other services. And so even as we become more distributed society focused, right? It may be that, we deal with 10 different companies and those companies deal with 10 different companies. And in the end, we're all dependent on each other. And we need to secure all those different things. So I don't really see a great answer for security other than we simply have to, everyone has to understand that we have to take it more seriously. Companies have to do it, but also consumers have to push for that. That's one of the, I feel personally, one of the biggest factors, especially IoT, which you brought up, right? Why is IoT so insecure? IoT is so insecure primarily because the consumer market forces it to be. Right, the cost of securing IoT is not nominal, and if consumers are willing to continuously buy insecure IoT devices, those IoT devices will remain insecure because quite literally consumers are incentivizing IoT makers to not secure them, and so that's something we need to push that awareness all the way down, or to the point where we govern it, and actually require companies to take action in some of those spaces. There may be answers, but they're going to have to be things like that. And this is not something where just knowing security a little bit better is going to fix the problem.
All right, Tim, let's talk to you again next. We're here today to talk about what you guys are seeing as far as the top 3 most common concerns that you're seeing from your customers. Can you walk us through what those are?
Yeah, sure. It's been pretty consistent when I talk to them, whether they're big enterprises or emerging SMBs. And they've been still keeping the site online when there's under a DOS attack. The second one is more broadly data theft. And we can talk about why that's complicated and what we see in that. And then the third one is the rise of malicious bots. And these are bots that are different from DDoS bots. These are bots that are automated scripts that just do bad things other than trying to take the site down.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's focus on first, as far as data theft. Are these different than maybe just some of the malware that we've seen or ransomware? What exactly do you guys mean by data theft?
Yeah, great. So a lot of times the things that get in the news are, malware, and that is a problem. And that's the thing that some people tend to just focus on. But the reality is there are lots of different ways theft can happen. And even if it's not as high profile, those are still real vulnerabilities. And there are 4 that we've identified that, maybe people don't talk about and aren't top of mind, but they're just as important. And there's still a weak link in your overall security defense. These include the following. One is malicious payloads being put on your website. And that's usually an entry for malware, but it may not need to install malware for your internal user. It could simply be something that can capture credentials. The second one is creating a fake site, so poisoning your DNS cache. Somebody thinks they're going to your site, they're going to a site set up by an attacker, and now your users are putting in sensitive information. The third one is it's unencrypted channels in the way you're communicating. And that can compromise you when somebody goes to, say, a Wi-Fi or a cafe, and it's just someone just comes in and snoops in on the wire. And the third one, which it sounds very rudimentary, but we see a lot of it, is just brute force. Somebody broke in, found a list of credentials, and they're just brute forcing them through different applications to just find that one where they can break in and take over the account. So those are 4 that maybe don't get as much press, but I actually see those vulnerabilities popping up when we actually talk to customers and explore, what are some areas that you may not have thought of, but that are really foundational to a pretty strong defense.
Scott, what can you tell us? You've worked with quite a number of companies. How do you feel like the threat of data theft is being handled? Is it something that folks are specifically preparing for, or is it just part and parcel of the entire security, preparation?
Well, I think it varies a lot by the type of organization. I think SMBs have a tendency to kind of miss data theft as a really specific thing. I think if you're into the Fortune 100 space, especially if you're into finance and banking, It's a very big deal. They understand the value of what they're holding, and so they look at it really carefully, right? So it does vary by industry and company size, but I think more or less across the market, what we're seeing is that companies are mostly taking kind of a one-size-fits-all approach for the most part, and are not putting a lot of focus into different components of security, right? Because obviously something like a DOS attack and something like a focused attempt to breach the internal network are very different things, and they require very different knowledge and techniques and so forth. So I think we see a mix, but I think what's needed is a lot more a combination of things. One is someone who's holistically in charge of security and tasked with interfacing with business and tasked with overseeing security posturing to make sure that those pieces are being covered. But then there needs to be domain experts in each of those areas, because the people who handle DOS needs and the people who are securing databases, for example, are it's different skill sets, it's different needs, it's different concerns, things that they have to be looking at. And looking at the news currently and the things that are going on today, we had, just in the last 2 hours, I saw the news. Yahoo has admitted to 3 times the breach. 2 or 3 billion accounts were compromised in 2013, and of course, everyone's talking about just this past week that the Equifax was breached, with basically every adult working American has had their complete, every bit of their financial and personal identification stuff has been leaked not because of traditional things, but because of just plain and simple focused attacks on a company that has a lot of valuable data that's worth stealing, and they didn't take very seriously the need to, one, oversee security at the CIO level, right? We didn't have those roles making sure that the people who are in charge of basic everyday security in the trenches were looking at security properly and taking care of those things. In this case, it was patching, right? No one was patching their systems. Very simple stuff, and even a pretty simple security protocol system would have addressed that particular instance. They would have still been attacked. They would still have a lot of money worth, a lot of data worth a lot of money that people would be targeting. But this particular breach could have been prevented very easily through some pretty basic security protocols.
Let's talk next about Mirai bots, because this is something that's also been in the news. Tim, what can you tell us about that? Would you say, we've brought up Internet of Things. Is this kind of one of the bigger byproducts of this number of internet-connected devices that we're going to be having?
Yeah, so as Scott alluded to, I think the Internet of Things presents a huge potential vulnerability. And not if you're not safe if you don't have an Internet of Things, or you're not an Internet of Things company. It's those are the sources, the hosts in which these attacks are going to come by. And that just amplifies the ability to attack hundredfolds. We in our own data have started to see devices, not just Mirai bots, but one example which we wrote about was compromised cell phones, which is sort of an advanced form of Internet of Things, right? It's a device that's connected to the internet. These cell phones got compromised, and they became the source of the attack traffic. And so I really think that in the world of Internet of Things, in DDoS attacks, we'll see much higher volume and much more distributed. That makes it much harder to stop.
Scott, you've had quite a bit of experience preparing for and combating against DDoS attacks. Do you mind sharing kind of how that experience was for you?
It was stressful. Yeah. So I don't know if lucky enough is really the term, but I've worked for one of the largest kind of NGO organizations that has a tendency to draw a lot of attention to itself. And so we actually, on a very regular basis, meaning about every 2 weeks, we would be faced with generally a state-sponsored distributed denial of service attack. So these are on a scale and complexity that's pretty much unheard of. And attacking that from the from trying to keep your services on site perspective is one, very difficult, right? We had an incredible engineering team and a lot of great people internally that were able to deal with being very agile and moving our services to different locations, moving our services to different IPs, moving to different hosts, working with really big providers who have a lot of that expertise that we needed, right? Because we can't do it on our own. It's not no amount of expertise for you as an individual company is going to make the difference. It has to be a team effort with security vendors that are in a position to really do something about that. And of course, Cloudflare is the leader in that from the DDoS perspective. I mean, no one plays in their space to the scale that they do, and so we were Cloudflare customers. So immediately our first things are reach out to Amazon, reach out to Cloudflare. That's who we partner with, and the three of us, along with a few other players. But these are the key is the three teams dealing with figuring out where it's coming from, what does it look like, how do we throttle it, how do we move, what do we cut and let go, how do we adjust to be ready for it. And each attack is different, so it's not the kind of thing you can plan for. So it's very much you plan as much as you can, but it's always a surprise, right? So it's very much a live triage operation with a lot of key players that simply have to analyze what's happening and offer solutions and do the best you can to try to drink from. It's like having 30 fire hoses turned on you at once. You have to drink from 30 while figuring out how to turn them off when you don't know where they are.
All right, then. Let's go back to you next. So let's talk about what can we do about this stuff. So for folks trying to figure out strategy to better protect their organization from all this fun stuff that we've been talking about, what advice do you have for people?
Yeah, so I liken it in this sort of, one takeaway from what Scott had said in terms of how you're trying to pinpoint issues. I liken it to a whack-a-mole. And so if you're just trying to wait for the thing to burst and you plug it in, plug that hole, and you plug the hole, you'll drive yourself crazy. So, I think sometimes you need to step back and say, what's my strategy? What I need to think about in terms of addressing it? Because the reality is attackers are going to change and evolve constantly. And so you need to have some way to say, how am I best suited to get that? And so I thought about it in terms of three ways. One is, as Scott alluded to, is scale. And scale does a couple of important things. We know the attacks are probably going to continue to get bigger. So you need the scale to be able to address that. The second thing is attackers are going to become harder to detect. So whoever sees more traffic will be able to better protect sites because they'll see the bad stuff as well as the good stuff and be able to filter it out. So an attack that happens on one site might be blocked before it reaches you. Whoever sees more traffic will be able to better protect you. When you combine that notion of scale, is able to protect when things are bigger, we're able to find bad things. That's a good sort of strategy to think about. The second one is one that I think people overlook, but I think is increasingly important, is ease of use. So in other words, if attackers are more agile, they're changing and more sophisticated, and at some point you're going to need the folks on your team or the people who work with you, advisors, as sort of Scott talked about, be able to react more quickly. Now, if the security solutions that you have to do mitigation are disparate, they're hard to use, they're complicated, you need to be a developer, security expert, you've really narrowed the scope of the number of people who can actually help you. And I think the challenge that many companies will be facing is they need to actually broaden the number of people who can do things to protect the perimeter, or not just the perimeter, but to make you more secure, not narrow it with just a handful of experts. So ease of use is a big way of contributing to that. And then the third one is, yes, we have to protect the companies from, especially those who are online, from security threats, but we can't compromise the success of the business. And on the internet, the story for success is often speed. And so if your site is slow, if checkouts are slow, you've compromised. And typically, a lot of security solutions, particularly those for public-facing assets, are inline, which means they add compute power to looking at and inspecting what's going on. And so really you have to think about a strategy of how do I not compromise speed, but still increase security.
Yeah. Scott, what about you? What are your kind of foundations for a strategy that protects against these types of attacks?
Well, I think that Tim covered that really well. Obviously, scale is huge. From the application side, it's not just operational, right? It's not just we can, we use Amazon, right? And we can make more servers. So that's one side, and that's valuable. And I think that that's one of the reasons why horizontally scaling applications today are a really big deal. But also designing applications, for example, in a non-blocking way. Simple new software design practices can take someone from highly vulnerable to moderately vulnerable, right? Simply by approaching those kinds of things differently. Partnering with the right companies, planning and having teams in place to deal with this before it happens. And I agree, ease of use is very important. This is almost nobody is doing this around the clock, right? When it happens, almost everyone, no matter how big of a company you are, no matter how much you deal with this, effectively everybody is kind of being caught by surprise when an attack like this happens, and they are not a domain expert in dealing with it. And so they need to be able to react quickly. They're not going to have been, working with those tools, the day before or the week before, and that's not, you cannot have time to be learning right then. So this is, very different than normal systems administration where you're doing the same tasks or similar tasks day after day. This is for effectively everybody a one-off or a very rare thing. Hopefully a one-off, right?
All right. And then one last question before we take questions from the audience. Tim, we've got a lot of folks in the IT Pro community. They know the technology. It's really around some of these business discussions, having that talk with management around building a case to make that investment in these security technologies. What advice do you have for people in this situation?
Yeah, that's a really great question. As we talk to mostly IT professionals, they usually get it. They know we need to invest in security. They already know sort of the details of how they can be DOSed. Is it a UDP? Is it an amplification? The different types of bots. And they understand that it's a problem that needs to be more secure. And nothing is more disappointing for them when we talk to them. They say, I couldn't get budget, so I can't do what I know I need to be done. And you can see that there's this frustration. They know what needs to be done, but they're actually not able to get the investment. And we found when we talk with them early in conversations, hey, if you can just bucket and just tell us, what are the areas that the security will help you? That helps them to get the investment they need. And we found that to keep it simple and not to make it overcomplicated, is there are two big buckets. One is sort of soft or non-quantitative, and I call it the brand and customer impact. So if you were to have one of these three types of attacks, what happened to your brand? What's going to be your perception? What's the leadership position that you guys will have if you're e-commerce or if you're a medical company? What are the risks? So that's one bucket. And then the second one is, can you quantify a dollar sense, either the revenue that's lost because your site was down or because something was broken, or what the costs were? You have to pay Amazon more because you've got all this unwanted traffic, or you've got to build out your IT team in order to do a remediation. What are those costs? And they don't have to be exact. They just have to be, hey, it's more than $5. It's a $500,000 problem. Like, it just has to be a rough estimate. And when they take that to other people in the company and say, look, there's two areas. It's either risk or your brand, or it's going to hurt your profitability. And then they just tie it to the problem. They're much more successful. They're happier. The company is safer. They're able to get the tools and the support they need. It's really a really valuable and critical part of that conversation.
All right. Scott, what's your advice? You know the community very well. How do you typically advise people to have these types of conversations?
I think Tim really alluded to this, and it's something that we say a lot, right? We have a lot of these kind of conversations, and not necessarily about security, just about everything, budgeting in general in IT. One of the biggest mistakes we see is IT pros very often want to go to the business and deliver them a technical solution. And so they come in and say, I want to buy this product, hire this team, do this thing, and it has a name, whatever. And the business simply sees someone who wants to buy something, right? They don't see what the value is because they have no idea. It doesn't mean anything to them. And so it doesn't matter if you're just getting some extra server capacity because you need to do some storage in-house, or you're dealing with the security of your website. You need to learn how to talk in business terms. And sometimes this simply is just a matter of changing your context, right? Take the time to think, this is not a technical person. They care about making money. I should be referring to things in terms of what is the value to the business. If you can't explain it, post on Spiceworks, right? And I've said this before, post on Spiceworks, explain to me as if I'm your manager, give me your dollars and cents. Why do you want to do the thing that you want to do? And chances are, simply by trying to explain it to me or anyone on Spiceworks, you explain to yourself that it's needed. And in a lot of cases, when you want that extra storage, you may explain to yourself that you didn't need it and you should not have made that request to your boss, right? That's a valuable tool just in general. But when it comes to something like security, taking that, extra couple hours, making an analysis, learning for your own value what the value of your services are, what the risks to your services are, what different kinds of risks you specifically have, can be absolutely enormous. And you will not only use this in this particular conversation, those same numbers or very similar ones are the same ones you're going to go take and say do a high availability conversation. Or at least the thought process that you go through will be something that in reality you should be going through all the time for nearly every decision that you make. And so it's a huge growth opportunity to get the things that you need for your department, and two, for you as a professional to make that leap from I'm a tech guy and the business has to translate me to I'm the tech leader and the business talks to me because we're already interfacing on their terms.
All right. We will go ahead and get some questions. I got a lot of really good ones. One from user Fergal9 that I thought was a great way to kind of start things off. So what are the first steps in order to protect a server against DDoS and other attacks? Starting from the basics. Tim, we'll start with you. What's your advice on this?
Yeah, cool. So I might seem biased, but let's listen to the logic behind it. A lot of times with a DDoS, they try to solve the problem at the server. And I would say that's the wrong place to solve it, because you don't know the size of the attack, which means you have to be able to scale and pay for bad traffic. Why would you ever want to do that? The best way to think about solving is who on the edge before it ever gets to your server is best positioned to block it. And so Cloudflare is one of those. They have 116 plus data centers around the world, so they can distribute it. And they're all on the edge, so we can block it. We often block it before it ever gets to your website. And we've designed to make it very simple at the DNS. And DNS is sort of the telephone book. So the moment somebody tries to look up who you are, we become the reverse proxy. And so instead of them hitting you, they come to us and they say, oh, Cloudflare, tell me who the name of the site is. And as soon as it comes through us, we can look at what the traffic is at the network layer or the application layer and say, boy, this is bad. Sorry, you're not going to go to the server. So I think that's a good way to think about it, is just, hey, how do you just get it at the edge in the simplest way possible with someone who has the biggest reach and the biggest sort of surface area to absorb bad traffic?
Scott, what's your advice? Venting emails. First up.
I kind of hate to be Polly Parrot here, but Tim's right. That's exactly, I've worked with this a lot, and in every case, it's Cloudflare that we turn to for exactly those reasons. It doesn't matter what you do or how big you are at the server level. When you get hit with a real DDoS, right? So I've been involved on both sides of DDoS, if you're dealing with very, very small scale, the things that you really aren't that concerned about, yes, you may be able to take care of it yourself simply by growing, by having bigger servers. But when you're talking about serious DDoS attacks, the ones that are actually orchestrated against you, there is nothing that you can do at the systems administration level to make any difference. It doesn't matter if you add 50 new servers. It doesn't matter if you go to bare metal. It doesn't matter if you switch to Node instead of Java or C#. You are going to be overwhelmed. They will just increase the attack until you cannot absorb it anymore, right? And your cost will go through the roof. And that may be their attack. They're less concerned about taking you offline as they are of draining your pocketbook. They get you either way, depending on what their goals are. But they are able to disrupt you in a business sense in some way. And that's why it really does have to be at the network edge. You have to accept that DDoS attacks are not something that skill is going to overcome or that money is going to overcome. It's something that you have to approach differently.
We're getting a lot of questions about IoT. I think we talked about it before, and I think it is a big concern. We'll start with Jay Huddleston's question. And I think just broadly speaking, do you guys feel like some of these IoT providers are doing enough to bump up their security posture What is your take on the current status of IoT security? Do you guys feel it's headed in the right direction? Tim, maybe we'll start with you again.
Yeah, I think actually Scott already mentioned it. There's a weird economic asymmetry for a lot of these manufacturers in terms of they need to make them cheap and available and distributed, and that puts in a huge amount of cost if they want to bake it into their device. So I don't know if they have a huge incentive to make it secure. But then again, looking at it is where's the best place, I think, to start to protect it. And these are distributed wherever they're, they're in your refrigerator, they're your doorbell, they are things on farms. And I think as these get distributed, I think where you want to protect them from being vulnerable is closest to them. And again, I'm biased, but again, thinking about it, where would you want to do this patching, to use Scott's analogy? And I would say you'd probably want to start patching those from being vulnerable for some kind of ingress attacks at the edge where they're closest. So if you're a farm manufacturer and you've got these devices in farms throughout the world, I don't know if you want to recall each one of them and then patch it, or try to connect to them because they often have intermittent connections. You probably want something at the edge, which can proxy the traffic and make sure nothing bad goes in there to do something to exploit a vulnerability. And so again, thinking about who's got the biggest surface area around the world, closest to where those devices are, that you can have potential ingress traffic come through, or even egress traffic to prevent bad stuff from happening. That's how I would think about it.
Mm-hmm. Scott, what about you? Do you feel like what's it gonna take for some of these IoT manufacturers to really prioritize security?
So I think it's a chain of events, and this is how I foresee it playing out for it to actually be fixed. The core problem is economics. People pay very little for these products, and they are not willing to prioritize security because it's not their own security that's at risk, right? They are becoming the source of attacks, and so this creates the economic problem. The person that you want to pay for the security is not the person who is under attack, so they won't, right? It's an unknown possible attack to someone else in the future that they don't understand. Why would they pay for that? So they will not pay for the vendors to be secured. The vendors can't afford it. They'll go out of business if they try to do it. So what does it take? And I think that the answer is that we need governments to step in and hold consumers accountable for purchasing and allowing to be exposed devices that are recklessly insecure. Of course, breaches happen, right? We can't just be ridiculous about this, but it needs to be you didn't take security seriously, you didn't pass it on to the vendor isn't going to do it. So if we hold people accountable, they will start going to vendors and holding vendors accountable and buying products that are secured, right? Whether they're secure or not, I don't know, but they're making an attempt at security and can go back and defend in court that we honestly tried to be secure, we followed best practices. Bad things still happen sometimes, but when we do that, we start having a chain of events where there's an accountability. Right now, there's no accountability, so you're just hoping that people who are not affected will invest to protect people who might be affected, and that's never going to work. And I also think that moving away from the thought, in some ways, thinking of IoT as IoT is very valuable because it really is a big group of things. But we run into a problem where no one can define what IoT is. There's not going to be a really simple standard answer across the board because everyone's going to be a little bit confused. It's way too much of a buzzword. And even within the industry, we struggle to define exactly what is and isn't IoT. Is your television that's really a computer IoT, or is it a computer? Because they're both computers and they're both on the Internet of Things. It's just a gray area of where we draw the line, but it becomes dangerous. You can't legislate around that. But the reality is you don't want to. You want to treat IoT devices the same as you would treat a laptop or a desktop or a server. If those things are breached and start attacking people, we normally do something about it. We need to treat IoT as just another server on the network and have uniform regulations that hold people accountable for taking action when those things happen. And I think that is the best path we have to kind of getting people on board with the right things to do.
Okay. Tim, let's go back to you for this next one. Trent the Gent asks, should only big companies be worrying about data theft? What is your thought on that?
Oh no, I think Scott alluded to this well. I just read an article now that in fact SMBs are starting to realize they are vulnerable and they're trying to find a solution. The problem is traditional data theft solutions are expensive. And so I think, looking for a vendor that's able to take things that you have to buy big racks of hardware and then make it really accessible in the cloud is probably the way I would go about trying to solve this. But SMBs are just as vulnerable, perhaps more so, in the sense if you were an attacker, yes, you could probably get more by going after Target, but wouldn't you also think, well, Target's probably really beefed up their security? Whereas if I can say I'm going to pick 20 community banks, I'm just going to do a hit and run, and I'm going to take them out. I don't know if an attacker were smart in trying to figure out, well, I'm just going to go after the ones that are more vulnerable. I think I'd probably do that instead of going after Fort Knox.
Scott, what are your thoughts? What are the risks for small businesses when it comes to data theft?
Small businesses have the benefit of having very little of value in most cases, but they also have the vulnerability of being 1,000 times easier to break into, right? And I think that small business actually, and we talk about this a lot in the community, I think one of the biggest problems facing small business is they actually have a lot of hubris a lot of times. There's an incredible amount of, we're so secure. I don't know how big companies aren't secure, but we're so secure. And that's simply not the case. Nobody's secure. That's kind of the first rule. Big companies simply know they're not secure. Small companies have a tendency to feel like they're awfully secure when they've done almost nothing. And so small companies have a tendency to be low-hanging fruit, even though they're not big public targets. And we don't hear about their breaches. So people tend to think, oh, no one's getting breached because they're not in the news. But of course they're not in the news. No one is going to report that the mom and pop down the street got breached. One, because nobody cares. And two, because the mom and pop might not know. Right. And three, the mom and pop they're not regulated. They don't have to report to anyone. They're not like Yahoo, who is legally obligated to tell you, or Equifax, who's legally obligated. These are companies that just get to hide it. They sweep it under the rug. They lost their customer list. They don't care, right? They just hope that it doesn't get traced back to them. Their greater risk is letting someone know. So they actually end up putting themselves in a position of even greater risk because they can't expose the fact that they need to get help because of the path that they often take. So I think that small businesses incredibly at risk to data theft, but is not so high as being at risk to necessarily knowing that it happened, and we're certainly not going to talk about it. I think what we will see, though, is that smaller businesses tend to be very, very, they're a way for attackers to build a resume because the big money is in state-sponsored attacks or in things that mimics, large organizational attacks. Those things are where the deep money is for the actual attackers, for the professionals who do this for a living. But you don't just walk in off the street one day to a state-sponsored organization and say, I'm going to help take down governments, I'm going to help take down NGOs. You have to have a track record, and small business provides that track record. You walk in, here's 100 community banks, here's 100 community hospitals, here's all their data. I did this all personally. That's how you get a 7-figure job with a state-sponsored organization.
You're a resume builder almost.
Right.
All right.
I would add one little coloring to that was he's mentioned that the data wasn't that valuable. I think, because governments are getting more involved and applying more scrutiny, the data is getting more valuable. So, and it also depends obviously on industry. So we have a number of small companies that are in the 200 person range, and they're dealing with your genes, they're dealing with your medical records. I mean, if even one part of that got breached, they'd be gone. We had one that they said they had no sensitive data, but they still were concerned about attacks because and they were a media company, so they said we don't have any customer information. But if we're attacked, if we're down by a DDoS, we're going to lose the trust of our advertisers. So there's some sensitivity, even though they don't have data. There's something about the site that needs to be secure. We found that some companies that just It was a pizza company, and we talked to them, and they had about 15 different locations, and they were just like, well, we have these records, and we have 3 million people's records, because even though 3 million are coming through, at one point in time they bought pizza, which means we have a name, we have an address, we have a credit card, and they're just a small pizza chain in like New Zealand or Australia, but they had to keep all that secure.
Yeah, that's a good point. Data is a lot more valuable than probably a lot of people are aware of. Let's take another question. This one comes from Crown Clown. And Tim, yeah, maybe now's a good time to kind of talk to us a little bit more about Cloudflare's capabilities. And he's asking, what are the current technologies cloud providers have in order to protect their customers' cloud savings?
Cool. That's a great question. So I think of the theme, if I had to say one throughout this, was there's lots of different attacks. Like there's big buckets, there's DDoS, there's data theft, and then there's bots. But each one of those has different flavors. There's a different flavor of DDoS attacks. There are a bunch of different ways you can have data theft, and there's a bunch of different ways that you can attack. You can attack through a bot. So I would look at something that's as layered as possible across your stack. And we kind of see things as network, DNS, and application. So that's sort of how Cloudflare thinks about it. We integrate everything at the edge. Again, we think size and visibility and traffic is the foundation. If you have somebody who only sees what you see, you'll never really be more protected than the attacks that come. You'll never know what else is out there proactively. So we built all this in an integrated stack on every one of our 117 data centers around the world. So you'll get protection in DNS, you have security, you have a WAF, which prevents malicious payloads. You have the ability to detect bots based on certain controls that you have. You have the overall arching DDoS protection. And then on top of that, you still want to keep your site fast because you really don't want to overload it with so secure, but nobody wants to come to your site. I mean, what would be the point of that? So then you want to be able to have someone that says, okay, well, you're not only safe, but we're going to accelerate traffic. We're going to compress and optimize your assets so it's delivered fast. So I would look for cloud providers to provide you the scale. That really is the power of cloud. True cloud is completely scalable and elastic. The second thing is you really want to have a bunch of these services, as many as possible, integrated seamlessly that provide both security and speed.
Okay. Scott, anything that you can add to that as far as technologies that you've worked with? I know you've worked with Cloudflare, but what are you seeing as far as the actual most effective for protecting cloud-based services?
I don't know that I really have anything to add. Tim has covered it pretty well. Cloudflare really hits things at the edge and has that visibility, and there's just nothing that's going to come close to that. From the perspective of the platform of cloud itself, the vendors like Amazon and IBM, SoftLayer, and companies like that, they have a lot of really great technology under the hood that they're supplying on their own, right? Whether it's their own security teams, their network monitoring teams, their load balancing, their firewalls, their deep inspection. But they're, as Tim alluded to, they're one step within, right? So they're better than you as far as scale and what they can block things before it gets to you, but they're not at the Cloudflare level of visibility and global scope, right? So Cloudflare kind of takes the really big global scope, right? And then your Amazons and your SoftLayers and your Azures, right? They give you kind of the data center scope, and then it filters down to you, and you get the server or the security zone scope. And each one is going to need to do a little bit, and but you need each one above you to take the brunt of what's coming, and then you get to take the next level. But at the end of the day, your platform team, your network team, all those people that are outside your organization, you need them, but inside you still need to have good, solid systems administration practices. You still need to have good software design practices, software engineering practices. But for the most part, within the organizations, other than knowing that you need to partner with the right people, other than knowing that you need to tackle the security things, your actual approaches internally to your individual systems are not changing dramatically. Yeah, we need to patch. We just need to patch faster. Right, we need to lock down firewalls. We just need to lock them down faster. We need to be more proactive about it. We can't be as loose as we could be 20 years ago. But those things were all there. We needed to patch before. We needed to have firewalls before. We needed to do those things, right? So I don't see that there's a huge change in technology. There's just kind of a change in scope for the most part, and then moving things farther out.
I would add a little bit to what Scott had said. If you're looking at a cloud and a platform, and it's not just the technology. It's a service. And so yes, you have this team, but like we have 40 round the clock security researchers looking at all this data. Like, do you want to have the 40 people on your staff managing that with a smaller data set and fewer tools? Would you rather just say, look, you guys, whoever it is, the cloud, you're not just providing technology. I want you guys to provide the expertise. I don't want to have to stay on top of every little thing that comes out. I want to run the business from an IT perspective to make sure things run, they work, we're efficient, we're productive, we're agile, we're innovative. I don't want to get bogged down on that. So it's not just the technology. We actually have experts that are leveraging our technology and data and updating things. I mean, imagine a WAF where you have to update things because it's a zero-day attack. It's something that no one's seen. Would you rather have someone else block it because they see it, or do you want to take that on? So I think sort of accentuating what Scott had said, there's technology, which is we think is important. It's being at the edge, integrated, sort of seamless. But then there's just underneath that, what's the service of expertise that you have access to? And I think we're in an age where, very specialized expertise is increasingly valuable, but it's also increasingly rare. And so it's better to leverage someone who has a concentration of that and just say, you guys take care of that. And then you go as a business, an organization, focus on what can I do in an IT world where I am the expert in terms of how our business is run.
I want to get to one last question because I think this is a good one. EBIT is asking about how secure are VoIP services hosted in the cloud? Can they be attacked and exploited? It would seem like data theft in this case for VoIP or even video conferencing could be a huge potential for crucial information that you are soon secure and could potentially be exploited. What are you guys seeing as far as that, Sim?
Well, I haven't seen it per se, but I think we're moving in that direction. We want to cover all protocols. Right now, we're just straight HTTP, HTTPS, but that's a request that goes to a site or an API or an application. But we definitely want to move and cover. There's all kinds of protocols where you're not secure. It's email, it's VoIP, SIP channels, all FTP. The older, the worse. So I think everything is vulnerable, and VoIP's a good example. There's lots of valuable information that's in there, and I think how do you address that and how do you protect yourself from that? I think that's a totally valid point.
Mm-hmm. Scott, is there anything that you can think of as far as like data theft risks or DDoS risks that folks aren't maybe thinking enough about, kind of similar to VoIP or video conferencing?
Just real quick about VoIP and video conferencing, I think one of the things that makes it a lot less vulnerable is that it typically is point to point, right? It's almost never a public service. Video conferencing a little bit more is a provider may be public, but an internal VoIP application does not need to be public. If you are being targeted to the point where someone is trying to shut down your internal ability to make phone calls extension to extension, okay, you may be in a really tough spot, but you're under an incredibly focused attack who's trying to disrupt specific people calling each other. That's you have something else going on. I've never heard about something like that in the wild. But because VoIP is not public, one, attackers generally can't see it, and two, it's very, very hard to attack because you are probably already cutting off, or should be cutting off, all of your traffic at the edge that isn't coming from yourself or your provider. So it's specifically a type of technology that is very resilient to DDoS attacks simply by the nature of how it can be secured and how its best practices already secure it. Even though you don't necessarily have leased lines when you're in the public, it's the kind of thing that can be mitigated in a very different way because your outsiders can't see that you're down, and that's because it's a layered network. You're simply connecting to a different network where the big vendors like Verizon and AT&T are already tasked with dealing with DDoS, and they own that network, and they're allowed to shut things down in a way that with centralized control that we can't do on the internet. So it's a different animal, and it does have its own security problems, but DDoS is really, for the most part, not one of them. or when it does, it affects you internally in a way that customers can't see, which is very, very important. You have mitigation techniques that are so effective that it's one of the most expensive, least valuable attack vectors for someone trying to disrupt you. So I just wanted to add that it really does play in a different space.
Okay. All right, guys. Well, we are starting to run out
That
of
did not
time.
answer your question. Can I jump on with there? I saw a question come by that I really want to answer real quickly.
Go for it.
And it's because Tim really can't jump on this one, but it was, how do you get your web host to use Cloudflare? And it was a great question because it relates so much to this. And as someone who's dealt in this space, people don't know I actually own a web host. But one of the things that's really important there is you as a web customer can go to Cloudflare. You do not need your web hosting company to talk to them, be involved with them, anything. If they are, that's awesome. Some will do that. Some do it intrinsically. That's relatively rare. But you, as someone who owns the website, the person who literally owns the URL, the domain name that you're dealing with, you are the one who has the right to go to Cloudflare and become a Cloudflare customer at all levels. You can use their free services, you can use their expensive services, whatever. The whole range are available to you. Your web host does not need to know or be involved.
Good advice. Guys, we're starting to run out of time, and I wanted to give you guys one last opportunity to share any final thoughts or advice that you might have. Scott, you've given us plenty, but any kind of final thoughts or parting words of wisdom that you might have for the audience today?
Find the right partners, be proactive.
Do your research. That's always good. Tim, what would you like folks that are watching today to walk away with?
Only the paranoid survive, and push as much stuff to the edge away from you as possible.
Good to know. All right, guys. Well, thank you again for hanging out with us today. Before we go, I did want to announce the winner of our GoPro Hero 5 Deluxe Bundle, courtesy of Cloudflare, is going to go to Mr. Ben Johnson, aka Ben JATC. Congratulations, Ben. You are the winner of our GoPro Hero Bundle. Hopefully you have a good time with that. It should be really fun. Please record all of your IT Pro adventures and share it with the rest of the community. We look forward to that. Scott and Tim, I had a great time hanging out with you guys. I thought today was actually it was a really good event. I definitely learned a lot, and I think a lot of folks that are watching today did too. So I hope we get a chance to do this again real soon. But until next time, guys, stay safe, keep it spicy. We'll see some of you guys at Spice World. Scott will take us all out for Flaming Dr. Peppers if you guys. Woo! And we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks, Scott. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, guys.